Hey guys, Alex here. So back in the fourth episode, I actually shared with you that mobility is key in Othello. And the key to mobility is in fact this term called tempo. So this episode will be dedicated to introducing you to the concept of tempo and basically why it's so important to playing this game. Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the concept of tempo. So this is in Paris, and that's the Eiffel Tower. Let's move on to the topics that I'd like to cover for today. Tempo. So the first topic would be introduction to tempo, or basically renda. So renda is the Japanese term of making consecutive moves, and also probably the focus, the single most important concept in the mid game, perhaps, because it's related to basically the number of moves that you can make at each area. And then, of course, the second topic, we want to look at some examples of how you can potentially lose and gain tempo from edges or edge play. And of course, there is also a potential tempo gain or loss that you can have from line control. So we'll show you some examples. So even though tempo is probably going to almost sound a little bit more abstract, but in the long run, you would actually be able to appreciate the concept as you actually play more games and you just observe a little bit more on the mid game and how things play out. Yep, so let's move on to the topics for today. So let's take a look at this particular shape that we have over here for an example of introducing you to the concept of tempo. So if you look at the overall shape on the board right now, you can see that white is somewhat centralized and its disks are grouped, while black is somewhat split into almost three different groups of disks. So if you look at if you think about the concept about playing group small inside, specifically group, and trying to keep your group of disks as compact as possible. So the reason behind actually advocating playing group is actually because you don't want to actually have your disks separated such that you create so many potential tempo or places where your opponent can play without creating more moves for yourself. So if you just look at this shape to your right over here, this group of three disks for black, essentially white could choose to actually, if let's say white were to play three consecutive moves on the right hand side, white could potentially play, if white were to play consecutive moves to the right hand side based on these three disks to your right, white could potentially just wrap up the disc by actually playing either g6 and h5, and that's two moves, and basically uses up all three black discs over here. However, there is also another way of white trying to expand the number of moves that he can make given the same shape. White could actually start with g4 and actually flip one disc to f5, and then followed by another move to h5 potentially, and flipping one more disc, and then finally white can play f7. Of course, you're going to ask me, how does it make sense that white can play three consecutive moves? So we are talking about how you can actually conserve moves and also make the maximum number of moves given a certain shape. So of course, the sequence does matter, but if we would like to conserve and play small and group, what we would like to do is actually try to play as many moves as possible given a certain shape and potentially within the same area as well. So if you keep that grouped and compact and derive many moves within that same area, you basically gain a lot of tempo, and at the same time you make your move once while your opponent has to play another move outside, creating more moves for yourself, and then you play another move within the same area twice, and then your opponent has to play a move to respond to that, which potentially creates more moves. So if you're able to actually understand the concept of tempo and just try to make consecutive moves in a very group, small inside, and a compact manner, you can actually gain a lot of moves and almost reduce your opponent's mobility fairly quickly. And of course, reduction of mobility would then allow you to dictate play and finally win the game. So that essentially is the basics to tempo and basically render. So one way I like to teach my students about saving moves, if you consider these three like this to be $3, you would probably prefer to spend $1 at a time instead of just spending all three at once, because each of these like this are actually critical for each and every move that you can make thereafter. You probably wouldn't want to squander it all in one move. So let's move on to the tempo gain in edges. Let us now talk about tempo gain from edges or edge play. So over here, if you look at this empty square on the edge, if white were to just play a move to e8 to initiate contact on the edge, so black would definitely have to respond by playing b8, and that would actually be just taking off the edge at the same time trying to avoid losing tempo. So tempo is something that we know as also like making consecutive moves. So if you say that you gain tempo, you basically gain number of moves in a particular area. So in this case, when your opponent initiates a contact to the edge, you actually have to consider, the first consideration would be grabbing the edge. If you do not grab the edge and you choose to play somewhere else, for example, right now if you're black and you choose to play b6 or maybe g4 or maybe g5, if you play a move on the outside, so we always talk about playing group small inside. So in this case, if you choose not to respond to the edge and instead you choose to play somewhere on the outside, for example g4, and you allow white to actually initiate that contact to the edge and at the same time take one more move to the edge to g8 and grab the edge, you are then forced to actually make one additional move on the outside again. So if you consider that exchange with white initiating contact and you making one move followed by white grabbing the edge and you making another move, you essentially lose tempo and you basically lose moves. And for white basically gains that tempo from grabbing the edge, initiating contact with the edge and grabbing the edge. So what exactly is the disadvantage here of actually losing tempo? So once you lose tempo, you then realize that you are actually one or two moves behind in the game, and that in itself will subtly affect the result of the game. So after white has done g8 and forced you to play one more move on the outside like g5, white could simply just cut into the center with e3, grabbing that e4 disc to try to attempt for an access to a quiet move. And of course, if you try to prevent that by maybe playing f3, for example, white can take one more move to maybe d2 or either e2 or d2, either one. If he takes d2, he removes this d6 disc that provides access to both moves. And essentially, you would then realize you are playing a chasing game in terms of number of moves, and you essentially lose tempo. So I will not carry on to actually illustrate the impact, but just know that in this exchange, for white initiating contact on the edge, the first consideration for black is to always grab the edge, even though the edge does, in fact, poison the rest of your moves. So in terms of tempo, this is very critical. So now I'd like to talk about tempo gain from line control. So one of the most common openings that actually involves a lot of line control and wrestling for control on the key centralization axis or lines is Sakaguchi opening. So over here we're in the middle of a typical Sakaguchi variation. So this opening was named after a Japanese 9-dan player. So Mr. Sakaguchi. So over here, it is actually white's turn to play, and basically black has a good move to f6 based on his disc right now located at d4, which gives him that access. And white would then play b4 to cut away that access and control this mini centralization axis or basically diagonal. In short, usually the Japanese refer it to line control. So we'll probably just talk about as controlling this line over here, this diagonal line. So basically you can see black doesn't have any disc on either end of it, and therefore would actually have to try to look for access to actually cut back into the center. And of course this horizontal line is also controlled by white, so you realize there isn't an easy way for black to actually follow to cut into the center. So over here, a potential way that black could cut into the center is actually d7. So he plays one move down, cut, to try to get back and wrestle back that control by capturing d4 disc. And of course, white then plays f2 to actually further prevent it from happening. So you realize that black is sort of stuck in a dilemma and doesn't really have a nice way to actually try to get back the d4 disc, and instead over here black follows with probably a standard variation to e2 to actually try to capture e5 and try to gain access back into cutting into the center, and also just trying to maintain his shape in the center. And of course, if white would just take it one step further, white could actually choose to play either g5 or c7. Either one removes the e5 disc and takes back control on this 2-disc line control. And of course, if you're able to establish such kind of line controls or extreme line controls in your mid-game play or in the opening, you can actually try to move your opponent out of his comfort zone and make him play a little bit more poison moves or awkward moves that actually involves flipping more disc, or you basically force an error out of him. So let's say if white were to follow with c7 and just flip e5 again, just wrestling back that control, you realize that black is sort of out of moves to try to gain access into either d4 or e5. Probably the best that he can do is do a4 perhaps, and of course a4 would then create d4, but over here a4 flipping 3 discs that are exposed to 4 separate squares seems to actually cost too much, and in essence, by establishing this line control by white actually gains tempo and forces black to make a loud move on the outside. And once, let's say, if black were to make a loud move on the outside to try to capture d4 in order to gain control, white, after making black go on a wild goose chase to try to wrestle that access, could essentially just jump into the move to take it away from him, or just prevent it one more time with a move like maybe c3. So either move would probably work, and it would then make black in a very off position situation whereby he has to do loud moves that actually create more quiet moves for himself. So if the game were to continue, white would have been set to actually gain tempo from line control by forcing black out of position and making loud moves to create even more moves for himself. So that essentially is tempo gain from line control. So there are definitely many different ways that you can actually perform line control, both vertically and horizontally and diagonally. So if you're able to come up with that line control and just force your opponent to make loud moves in order to contest or wrestle back that control of the center or key positions, you basically gain that tempo and force him out of position. So that's all I have today for just a quick introduction to tempo. We will definitely be covering more shapes and patterns in the future episodes. And of course, the special maneuvers that will follow in the next few episodes would actually all be about capturing moves and gaining tempo. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next episode.